Hello, Melbourne. My name is Matthias, joining from Switzerland in Europe. I followed the conference the last 2 days very closely, and I have to say, lots of interesting insights. You must be tired after those 2 days, jam-packed with information and insights, practical advice. So now I want to give you a short break, and it's also great that you are there in person. I'm a bit jealous of you. I couldn't make it for a number of reasons, but you should use this opportunity of being in a room with a lot of API practitioners, because the next API you will use in your company could be written by the guy or the girl left or right of you. So let's take 30 seconds to just introduce yourself to your neighbors. Talk about the conference, talk about what you do with APIs. All right, great. Lots of introductions. Don't forget to exchange your LinkedIn. And we're coming to today's last talk. It's about a couple of insights that I got from my job as API strategist, where I talk to lots of companies about their API strategy, about their API initiative, where there are things that are good, where there are things that are not running as they want. And when you hear something the first time, well, you work out the solution. You hear something the second time, you think, I've heard that before somewhere else. If you hear it the 10th time, I think you start to realize, hey, this is a pattern. This is something that's not just one company who has this issue with their APIs. And this could be something that can be applied maybe also in your business, in your company, in your API initiative. And when you know about this from the start, then you can avoid it. And that's why I created this talk based on my experience working with API practitioners around the world. And I compiled this list of 7 common mistakes in building API businesses. Okay, good. I want to say that, well, you could say it's mistakes, and but I don't really want to blame anyone. There is this concept of a cognitive bias. Here are the nice graphics that represents this cognitive bias. And it just means that your brain is wired a certain way that it doesn't see certain types of errors. And that can be for a number of reasons. For example, because you need to act fast, because you need to act under uncertainty, because you don't have enough information or you don't have enough meaning, because there's too much information, so information overload, or you don't know what you should remember out of all of this data. So there's these cognitive biases that sometimes trick us humans. And I want to frame it from that perspective, that sometimes we get tricked by our own thinking in the API world when we were trying to build API businesses. And these are the top 7 kind of mistakes that I have seen, that I've come across, and we'll go through them one by one. So the first one is the illusion of a one-dimensional API design. What do I mean by that? Well, we all usually start our API initiative from the IT department, from the technology perspective. And we do really well with this perspective when we're building internal API programs, right? We do technical design. We take one design decision after the other. And those are all technical design decisions. For example, we do resource design for our REST interfaces. We do apply API style guides. We build API style guides. And then we build open API specifications, right? And we follow these best practices of technical API design. Now, this is all good, and this is excellent if you do this, but you shouldn't forget that there is a completely different world, a bigger world. There is another dimension when you talk about the API economy or when you want to build an API business. And that's the business dimension of API design. And when you just walk one-dimensional, it's like flat Earth, right? It's you're completely missing a part of reality. And that reality is this multi-dimensional API design, where it's not only the business dimension that comes in addition to the technical dimension of API design, but also, for example, the organizational dimension of API design or the compliance dimension of API design, standardization, lots of things that need to be considered, right? So I just want to broaden your perspective here so that you don't only think about the technical dimension of API design. Important is also when you do design decisions along those, let's say, two dimensions, the order in which you do those design decisions, right? So don't do all the technical design decisions and then in the end ask, how do we make money with this API? Or what's the business model for this API that I spent a lot of money for building, right? You should think about what's the right order for taking those design decisions, no matter in which dimension. Typically, I advise people also against doing an upfront business design. What I typically say is it's best to do a co-design between your business design decisions and your technical design decisions, right? If you front load your business design, then your requirements, your business requirements, might be very restrictive so that the technical solution for building the API is suboptimal and maybe too costly. Yeah? If you work together between business and IT to optimize, so to say, your design and do your design decisions that way, that leads to typically a much better business and technical outcome. And for a lot of technical people in the API space, the question is, hey, what is this business dimension of API design, right? What do I need to consider there? What design decisions do I have to take? So here on this slide, I've listed a couple of those design decisions, and I'm not going to read them all out for you. You can get this slide later on. There's also a blog article written about this where you can go and read this up. So an example, who is the API consumer? Very basic, but very important business design question. Who do I want to design this API for? Who shall use it? What are the needs? What pains do they currently have? What gains can they get from using this API? And these are just a couple of those business design decisions that you should think about. We'll, in the course of this talk, also go into some more. Very good. So it's not good to only look at the technical design decisions, but equally bad is it if you only look at APIs through the lens of compliance. And this is a real threat or a real danger, because now we have throughout the world a lot of API-based regulation, meaning that there is a law or regulation that requires certain industries to build APIs. Prominent is banking, open banking. So here's a map of the world with, in green, all the countries that have an open banking regulation. CMA 9 in England, PSD2 in Europe, CDR in Australia, just to name a few. And then in yellow, there are also countries that have a market-driven approach that then work mostly with technical standardization. But regulation those green countries, is not limited to the banking industry. Now it goes into other industries, and of course in Australia, you know this with CDR, but there's also in Brazil, for example, there's insurance as a regulated API business. It's also being discussed in Europe. You know from CDR that the energy market is now being regulated with APIs. In the future, there's probably telecommunications. Banking, of course, is already done. And the thread here, or the danger, is that this external input, for example, with deadlines, gives you this tunnel vision of just doing compliance with these APIs. Right, so here is a deadline list or a milestone list for CDR implementation. On the left, you can see the banks, and then you can see the energy companies. So there's a lot of deadlines that need to be kept, and then there's also a threat, an enforcement threat. What happens if you don't comply to this deadline? Then there's court proceedings, you can lose certain licenses, and it's not very pleasurable. So all the companies strive to be ready by the deadline. And that creates a lot of stress and a lot of tunnel vision and focus on compliance. You forget about the technical dimension of API design, you forget about the business dimension of API design, and API just becomes a project that you need to get through for a certain deadline. And that's a real danger of seeing APIs that way, right? You cut yourself short and the options that APIs would otherwise give you. So you should work against that and position APIs from the start as a set of products with a product portfolio that need to be maintained long term, and not just a project that is then at a certain time finished and you can forget about it. Right? And also the perception that API and the topic of API is just about compliance. Right? For us technical people, this is maybe not such a big concern, but for the managers and executives, it could be there could be a danger that they start seeing APIs purely from the compliance perspective. And whenever you approach them with a new API topic, they just think compliance and that way, right? So you want to broaden this perspective from the start and position API as a business concept right from the get-go. Okay, so mistake number 3, this could easily be mistake number 1, and that is a mistake of too little or no customer centricity. Yeah. So what I see sometimes in companies that primarily have an internal API program and want to expand and want to go into the API economy and take some of their APIs, externalize them, and give them to other companies, is that they use this inside-out technology-driven API design approach. They look at the internal technology that they have, the apps, the processes, the models, the data, and that's the starting point for them to build an API. Right? They spent then all the time and effort to build this API, get it ready, get it tested, get it security tested, and so forth, and then they bring it in front of a customer, and the customer typically then says, how shall I use this API? What is this? I don't understand this, right? Which is a pity after all this effort that has gone into it. A much better approach would be if you turn this around, right? You shouldn't just focus on the internal systems and technology, but you should focus on the API customer. And who is better to tell us this than Steve Jobs? He once said, you have to start with the customer experience and work backwards towards technology, not the other way around. Right? So brilliantly said there. And this applies not only for user interfaces, but also for application programming interfaces, right? For our APIs, we need to start with the customer and the customer experience and work backwards. In order to do that, we first have to ask ourselves, who is actually this customer? Who's the customer of your API? Right? If you look at the regular value chain in an enterprise, then typically you have some business assets, you have the organization that brings out an app and gives this app to an end user. Could be an insurance company, could be a bank, right? And here it's very clear who the customer is. It's this end user that gets our app and buys our stuff with this app. That's the customer. But with APIs, that's not really the case, right? We need to rethink who our customer is, and we need to rethink that and reinforce and really point that out in all our discussions so people don't forget. Because when they talk about the customer, they have a certain persona in their minds. So we need to re-emphasize, hey, with APIs, we have a different, longer value chain. And when we talk about the customer, it's not the end user. There's someone in between. And that's our customer, right? It's the API consumer who's in between the end user and the API provider. And that's the API customer we need to focus on. All right. So now we know who the API customer is. Now we can do some customer-centric design. And to do customer-centric design, we start with the customer and empathy for all the customers' challenges, right? So it's developers. Who are these developers? What challenges do they have? What needs do they have? And we can think about the journey that they typically go through when they work together with a new API provider to really better understand their position and really thinking from the API consumer's shoes. Where are those shoes? I think it's Twilio's office who has shoes of their customers hanging in the developer's office to remind them of thinking from the developers or from the API consumer's perspective. All right, so here a little visualization of how to think about it. You start with the customer, identify the customer segments. You think about what jobs do they need to do, what gains can they get from the API, what pains do you want to relieve with the API, and only when you have this customer insight, you then kind of construct product market fit by your insight about the market and the customers, by creating gain creators, by creating pain relievers for exactly those things that are important for the customer. And then only in the end, you create the technology that realizes those gain creators and pain relievers, right? That's the Steve Jobs way of doing it, starting with the customer and customer experience, and then going towards the technology. Now, I just told you that you need to be customer-centric. Mistake number 4 is just the opposite. It's too much customer centricity, right? So sometimes people take this lesson too literal and they do something that's called overfitting with their APIs. The advice here is that you should listen to what customers need and not what they say they want, okay? The need, the underlying need is the important thing, because that's where you can also see commonality amongst different API consumers. Sometimes when you talk to different API consumers, some are a little bit quiet and some are very loud and vocal about their requirements, and you tend to listen to them. And what comes out is a really a bespoke API that just fits the needs of this one customer that was very vocal and very loud. So you want to avoid that. And the best way to avoid that is that you listen, not what they really say, but you listen to the needs underneath it. If you want to remember this, then remember Henry Ford, because he said that brilliantly when he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And luckily, he didn't listen too literal to what the people said, to the solutions, the inferior solutions that people proposed to him. He listened to the need underneath. He listened to people want to get from A to B much faster than they can now. And he worked out his own solution with his own technical knowledge for solving that problem. And I think that's what we also should do with APIs. Okay, the next common mistake, number 5, is no API mandate, right? So you probably have heard about or have seen the API mandate of Amazon, right? It was in the year 2002 when Jeff Bezos allegedly wrote this memo. It's not directly that we know about it. It's just through a former employee that worked at Amazon at that time and published it from his memories, based on his memories. But it basically was a mandate for building APIs, telling the people why APIs are so important for the future of the company. And of course, that helps in every way to spread APIs inside the companies, and that APIs are built and that they get the attention that they should have to succeed. Now, recently in the year 2022, so 20 years later after that first API mandate, we see this again with another company. So here from Coinbase and Brian Armstrong, who wrote about APIs instead of meetings. I think that generated a lot of attention also on social media. But the ideas of Amazon wrote about 20 years before, still valid, still super important, and still, in my opinion, too little CEOs who write about this. So does your CEO write about APIs and why it's important to have APIs? Maybe getting an API mandate in that fashion would also support your API initiative. And maybe it doesn't need to be the CEO. It can be some other executive who supports your API initiative. Well, mistake number 6 is trying to apply direct API monetization on all your APIs, right? So maybe you have come across Twilio or SendGrid or Stripe, and you have seen how they make money with APIs, and you thought that's what we will apply in our API program as well, right? So you put a price sticker on all the APIs, right? That typically doesn't work, okay? So the API business opportunity is typically much wider than believed. Finding out how to make money with APIs. And what they typically come up with is exactly those shiny examples from the API economy, the Twilios and the Stripes, that use a concept called direct API monetization, where a customer calls an API, and for this call, for the access to the API, he needs to pay. And that's exactly the same as if I would buy a cup of coffee. To get access to this cup of coffee, I need to buy it, probably except at this conference, because there you get coffee for free. But if you go to a Starbucks, you would probably need to pay for the coffee. Good. And here's an example from Twilio where they have their API portfolio, and there is a price sticker next on the blue box here next to every API that they have. But APIs are, and API monetization are much wider than the world of direct API monetization. There's also indirect API monetization. And in fact, it's indirect API monetization, which is used in the majority of APIs in the API economy. But sometimes people look at me when I talk about indirect API monetization and they say, like, does that really exist? And what is that? And how does that work? And is there really anyone using that? And then there's actually a very famous or well-known company that uses indirect API monetization. That's eBay. eBay has this marketplace, right? And they published in 2020 that they have $5 billion in gross merchandise bought achieved via their API program. It generates revenue, right? Via the API, they generate a tremendous amount of revenue, but the API itself is actually free. And that's the power of indirect API monetization. And that's what confuses a lot of people. So let's look into indirect API monetization. How does that actually work? You need to start with a product that's not your API, an existing product. In eBay's case, it's the marketplace with those product listings, right? If you are a bank, you have a bank account as your product. If you're an insurance company, you have an insurance policy. If you're an automotive company, you have your cars as products. If you're a software company, you have SaaS or a mobile app as your product. And if you're a hardware company, you have an embedded system as your product, maybe. And those existing products that you have, they are already monetized, right? You make money with those existing products. Now, what you do with indirect API monetization is you put an API next to it. I've visualized it here as a building block, as a Lego building block, because it can be integrated into other solutions, just like a Lego building block can be used to put together a bigger solution, or in this case, then a bigger digital solution with APIs as digital building blocks. Now, this API is next to the product, and this API is given out for free. You don't charge for the API. It's not direct API monetization. Right? There is no price sticker on it, and you also give it out to a different group of people. So the product, your regular product, you give it out to end users, to your regular customers that you have in your company. But the API, you give it out to developers, right? Different group of people. The important thing about indirect API monetization is the relation between this API and your existing product, right? And the relation should be that the API helps to sell the product. And it can do that in a variety of ways. And that way, it creates this indirect monetization where via the product and the sales of the product, the API is actually monetized. So I said that this relation between product and API is so super important. So let's look into that. Let's take the magnifying glass and zoom in there and see how this relation can actually be constructed. There are a couple of patterns actually how to construct that. I don't say I know all of them, but I've seen a couple of them, and I will just list those that I know here. There are probably a lot more. For example, the API can be a feature, the API can be a sales funnel, the API can be a data feed, or the API can be internal for an omni-channel experience. So looking at that in more detail, pattern number one is the API is a feature of the product. Let's take, for example, Spotify. Spotify has this amazing product, and there are a couple of features inside this product. For example, you can listen to music, you can search for music, you can get recommendations for new music, right? These are all features. The API is another one of those features. Now, this API is also a very special type of feature because you to connect Spotify to a lot of other apps that the customer also have that are kind of in the digital environment of this customer, right? So this customer of Spotify might also use Facebook, like Running Club and Waze. And now, via the API, this ecosystem emerges where it makes sense to use all of these programs in combination, right? And they make them more powerful, and it creates this lock-in effect. Now that I have Spotify and it's integrated with Facebook and Nike Running Club, I'm not going to change it. It works so well in all these other apps that I use every day. There's no reason for me to change it. It makes the API, in this case, makes the product more attractive. It's a feature, and that way the product gets sold more, people stay subscribed at Spotify, and the API is indirectly monetized via the product of Spotify. Pattern number 2, the API is a funnel to get sales in for the product. For example, on eBay, they need to sell those items that are listed on their marketplace. And the API is like a funnel, and leads come through it, because now the API allows you to get those leads, the people who want to buy the products listed there, not only via the eBay website, but also via third-party websites. Those third-party websites might be very niche, or might be very specialized to a certain topic, and it would never be possible for eBay to be in all these long-tail markets present without the API. Right, so this is typically also a long-tail strategy, this possibility to get leads out of very specialized niche markets makes the product more attractive and, again, indirectly monetized. Here we have eBay, who's using that. And another example that you might know is travel insurance, embedded travel insurance. When you book your travel by a booking website, sometimes there's a little checkbox that says add insurance. And that goes off via API to an insurance company who sells you this API, right? The API, not the API, it sells you the insurance via API, right? So the API is the salesperson, basically, that gets the person from the travel booking who has the need for an insurance over to the insurance. All right, so pattern number 3, API feeds data into the product. For example, right here, lots of examples from social media, right, where the API for power users, listing things on eBay, listing things on LinkedIn, on Twitter, you use the API, right, to feed data into the product. The data itself is the product, or the product is a data-driven product. But there's also other examples. Car insurance. Yeah. You can offer better car insurance if you know about the driver's behavior. Is this a risky driver or a decent driver? And if the car insurance would know that, they can offer a better rate. And that makes the product, the insurance product, more attractive, right? So there are a couple of insurance businesses who offer that you can basically provide your data and via API, of course, and make the product that way more attractive to the customers. Fourth example is the API delivers data on multiple channels. Classical omni-channel experience with Netflix as a prime example, where the API is actually internal. It's not really external and used by lots of people, but it allows you to switch seamlessly from one channel to the other channel. You stop watching your movie on one channel on your TV, for example. You're on the go, and you can finish your movie maybe while you're on the train or on the bus. Right. Again, here, this omni-channel experience makes the product more attractive. And now we come to the interesting question. After exploring what direct API monetization is and indirect API monetization is, when should I use which? Right. And it really depends on your digital business model. When you have kind of a business model where you primarily ship a product, think again, a bank account, insurance policy, a car, software, that to your customer, and the product is the prime thing that your business model needs to deliver as value proposition, and this product is not an API, then indirect API monetization is actually the right thing to do. But if you go through digital transformation and you think about opening new revenue streams and new business model, you can think about, hey, we have our business assets and capabilities. Those are exposed via API to API consumers who are building apps, who are then giving it to end users, right? So the classical API value chain. Then the customer is actually the API consumer, and that way we can have direct API monetization. But of course, this is not for every business. And now related to that is the question or the mistake of saying we need to find a new business model for our APIs. So I see this sometimes, and I'm a bit ambivalent in answering this. There are pros and cons for a business model for your API. A lot of cons. Typically, when people want to find a new business model for the API that they have built, the question comes too late. It's like finishing your API and then saying, how do we make money with it? What business model should we have with it? Right? It's actually such a fundamental question that it should ask earlier. The effort for building up that's huge, right? And the change to accommodate an API that typically doesn't make a lot of sense. But sometimes business model innovation and finding new business models can be really good for the business. But I'm not sure it's always the API that should be the trigger for finding a new business model. Now, what people sometimes say is the reverse. Well, if you don't find a new business model for your API, then you should have APIs for your business model. And there are pros and cons for that as well. A lot more pros, though, where you do, let's say, just product innovation for an existing business model. Makes a lot more sense. It's more pragmatic, more likely to succeed if your API as a technical enabler just supports the business model that you already have. But, and there is a but, sometimes the business model that you already have is not a digital business model. And when there is no digital business model, there needs to be somehow a trigger to tell that business, hey, you need to get a digital business model to be part of the digital economy. So my conclusion out of this is that typically you should find APIs that support your digital business model. So if you already have a digital business model, that's all you need to think about, right? Find APIs for that digital business model that your organization already came up with. But if you don't have a digital business model already, then you need to first go into business model generation and find a new digital business model, right? And your focus in finding a new digital business model should probably not be specifically on APIs, which is just one technology, but you should think broader about digital business models for your organization. And then once you have found that, you can build APIs for it. All right. When you need to find digital business models first, then it can be helpful to have a little bit of a reference model. I found this book here really useful. It's a book from MIT professors. It's called What's Your Digital Business Model? Peter Biehl and Stephanie Werner, who have written that book, and they classify digital business models into 4 categories. And they organize it along 2 dimensions. So the first one is the business design. Is it a pipeline or value chain business, or is it an ecosystem business? And on the other dimension, you look at how much do you know about your customers. You have complete knowledge, or you have only partial knowledge. And out of this comes this 2x2 matrix for digital businesses or digital business models. It's a categorization. Of course, there's a lot more digital business models, but you categorize those into those 4 buckets where you have supplier business models, you have omni-channel business models, for example, Netflix, we have seen that before. You have modular producer business models. An example is Twilio with their APIs, right? The API is a product here. That's a modular producer. Or you have an ecosystem driver business model where there is a company that orchestrates an ecosystem around its products. For example, Spotify or eBay. Now, after you have come up with a digital business model, right? You can use this framework to find a digital business model. You then find APIs for this digital business model. And depending on which of those you've chosen, you can also use different API monetization techniques. For example, for Netflix and the omni-channel experience, there is the indirect API monetization. Or let's look at Twilio with the modular producer business model. There you have API as a product with direct API monetization. Now, for the ecosystem driver business model, there's a lot of different patterns, all of which are indirect API monetization patterns. So, for example, the API feeding data into the product. It could be the API as a feature to enable that ecosystem to emerge, or the API as a sales and marketing funnel. All right, so this just as an inspiration. First, do some digital business model generation and innovation in that arena first, and then try to find APIs that fit into that business model using the right type of monetization. So yeah, that was a quick look at 7 different mistakes that you typically see companies make for the API economy when they try to enter the API economy. I hope this was useful for you, so you don't step into those traps. Learn from the mistakes of others. I wish you all the best. I hope you had a great conference, lots of insights, lots of new connections in your network, and I hope to see you again in one of the future API conferences. Thank you.